I want to focus on one last point. We believe that we have established overwhelmingly that both articles of impeachment fail to allege impeachable offenses. Therefore, both Articles 1 and 2 must fail. This entire campaign of impeachment that started from the very first day that the president was inaugurated was a partisan one, and it should never happen again. For 3 years, this push for impeachment came straight from the president's opponents, and when it finally reached a crescendo, it put this body, the United States Senate, into a horrible position. I want to start by taking a look back. On the screen is a graphic of a Washington Post headline on January 20th, 2017. The campaign to impeach President Trump has begun. This was posted 19 minutes after he was sworn in. I also want to play a video where members, as early as January 15th, 2017, before the president was sworn into office, were calling for his impeachment.
I want to say this for Donald Trump, who I may well be voting to impeach.
I think that Donald Trump has already done a number of things which legitimately raise the question of impeachment.
And I will fight every day until he is impeached.
I rise today, Mr. Speaker, to call for the impeachment of the President of the United States of America.
The main reason I'm interested is not so much to win the Senate, which is a byproduct. It's because I think he's committed impeachable offenses. He needs the scarlet eye on his chest.
But if we get to that point, then yes, I think that's grounds to start impeachment proceedings.
So we're calling upon the House to begin impeachment hearings immediately.
Why do you think that President Trump specifically should be impeached?
Well, there are 5 reasons why we think he should be impeached.
On the impeachment, Donald Trump, would you vote yes or no?
I would vote yes.
I would vote to impeach.
Because we're going to go in there, we're going to impeach the mother.
I introduced articles of impeachment in July of 2017. All I did yesterday was make sure that those articles did not expire.
I'm concerned that if we don't impeach this president, he will get reelected.
It is time to bring impeachment charges against him.
My personal view is that he richly deserves impeachment.
One of the members of the House of Representatives said, we're bringing these articles of impeachment so he doesn't get elected again. And here we are 10 months before an election, doing exactly what they predicted. The whistleblower's lawyer, Mr. Zaid, sent out a tweet on January 30th, 2017. Let me put that up on the screen. The coup has started. First of many steps. Rebellion. Impeachment will follow ultimately. And here we are. What this body, what this nation, and what this president has just endured, what the House managers have forced upon this great body is unprecedented and unacceptable. This is exactly and precisely what the founders feared. This was the first totally partisan presidential impeachment in our nation's history, and it should be our last. What the House Democrats have done to this nation, to the Constitution, to the office of the president, to the president himself, and to this body is outrageous. They have cheapened the awesome power of impeachment, and unfortunately, of course, the country is not better for that. We urge this body to dispense with these partisan articles of impeachment for the sake of the nation, for the sake of the Constitution. As we have demonstrably proved, the articles are flawed on their face. They were a product of a reckless impeachment inquiry that violated all notions of due process and fundamental fairness. And then incredibly, when these articles were finally brought to this chamber without a single Republican vote, the managers then claimed that now they need more process. Now they need more witnesses. That all of the witnesses that they compiled and all the testimony that you heard was not enough. That your job was to do their job, the one, frankly, they failed to do. We've already said many times the charges themselves do not allege a crime or a misdemeanor, let alone a high crime or misdemeanor. There is nothing in the charges that could permit the removal of a duly elected president or warrant the negation of an election and the subversion of the American people's will. And that should be whatever party you're affiliated with. You are being asked to do this when tonight citizens of Iowa are going to be caucusing for the first caucus for the presidential season, election season, for the Democratic Party. Tonight! I think there's one thing that's clear. The president has had a concern about other countries carrying their fair share of burdens of financial aid. No one can doubt, and I think we've clearly set forth the issue of corruption in Ukraine. The president's and the administration's policy on evaluating foreign aid and the conditions upon which it's given have been clear. Mr. Papura laid that out in great detail. The bottom line is that the president's opponents don't like the president, and they really don't like his policies. They objected to the fact that the president chose not to rely each and every time on the advice of some of his subordinates, even though he, not those unelected bureaucrats who work for him, were elected to office. The president, under our constitutional structure, is the one who decides our nation's foreign policy. Here is a perfect example. The House managers brought this up frequently. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. He admitted on page 155 of his transcript testimony that he did not know if there was a crime or anything of that nature. That's his quote. But that he, again, quote, had deep policy concerns. So there you have it. The real issue is policy disputes. Elections have consequences. We all know that. And if you do not like the policies of a particular administration or a particular candidate, you are free and welcome to vote for another candidate. But the answer is elections, not impeachment. To be clear, in our country, in the United States, the president elected by the American people is, in the words of the Supreme Court, the sole organ of the federal government in the field of international relations and foreign policy for our government. No unelected bureaucrats, not unhappy members of the House of Representatives, and however you were to define high crimes and misdemeanors, there is no definition that includes disagreeing with a policy decision as an acceptable ground to removal of a president of the United States. None. The first article of impeachment is therefore constitutionally invalid and should be immediately rejected by the Senate. Now, as to the second article of impeachment, President Trump in no way obstructed Congress. The president acted with extraordinary transparency by declassifying, releasing the transcript of the July 25th call and the earlier call. It is that July 25th call which is purportedly at the heart of the articles of impeachment. He did so soon after the inquiry was announced. And despite the fact that privileges apply that could have been asserted, he released them anyways in order to facilitate the House's inquiry, cut through all of it, all of the hearsay, all of the histrionics, to get the transcript out. Now, I want to take a moment, because my colleague, Deputy White House Counsel Pat Philbin, addressed this idea of privilege. I've heard over and over again, and you have too, phrases like cover-up, that the assertion of a privilege is a cover-up. Here's what the Supreme Court of the United States has said about privileges in a variety of contexts. To punish a person because he has done what the law allows him to do is a due process violation of the basic order, the basic sort. And for an agent of the state to pursue a course of action whose objective is to penalize a person's reliance on his constitutional rights is patently unconstitutional, and how much more so when you're talking about the President of the United States. How about this? And this goes in the context of assertions of privileges, other constitutional privileges. The allegation has been that if you assert a privilege, you're assumed to be guilty. That's been the assertion. Why would you do that? Well, we've explained at great length, and I do not want to go over that again, the importance of the executive privilege and what it means to separation of powers and the functioning of our government, but I will say this. As the Supreme Court has recognized in other contexts with other privileges, the privileges served to protect the innocent who otherwise might be ensnared by ambiguous circumstances. In another Supreme Court case, Quinn versus the United States, the privilege this court has stated was generally regarded then as now as a privilege of great value, a protection of the innocent. The opinion goes on to say, and a safeguard against heedless, unfounded, or tyrannical prosecution. I trace for you, and I'm not going to do it again, how all of this started, all those years ago, 3 years ago, how all of this began. There is no point to go over that because that evidence is undisputed. And the FISA court's most recent orders put that in fair play. We've talked about the fact that the House violated its own fundamental rules in a series of unlawful subpoenas. I won't go over that again. Mr. Philbin laid that out in great detail. But I do think it's important to note that when seeking the advice of the president's closest advisors, despite the well-known bipartisan guidance from the Department of Justice regarding immunity, the House managers act as if it does not exist. They sought testimony on matters from the executive branch's confidential internal decision-making process on matters of foreign relations and national security, and that is when protections are at their highest level. Let's not forget that the House barred the attendance of executive branch counsel at witness proceedings when executive branch members were being examined. Notwithstanding these substantial abuses of process, the executive branch responded to each and every subpoena and identified the specific deficiencies found in each. You cannot just remove constitutional violations by saying you didn't comply. You've heard that one recipient of a subpoena, and this is, in fact, we've talked about it a number of times, but I think as we wrap up, I think it's worth saying again, one subpoena recipient did seek a declaratory judgment as to the validity of the subpoena that he had received. It was set up to go to court. A judge was going to make a decision. The House withdrew the subpoena and mooted the recipient's case before the court could rule. Now, was it because they didn't like the judge that was selected? Was it because they didn't like the way the ruling was going to go? Was it they didn't mean to have that witness in the first place? Whatever the reason, there is one undisputed fact. As the case was in court, they mooted it out by removing the subpoena. The assertion of valid constitutional privileges cannot be an impeachable offense. And that's what Article 2 is based on, the obstruction of Congress. For the sake of the Constitution, for the sake of the office of the president, this body must stand as a steady bulwark against this reckless and dangerous proposition. It doesn't just affect this president. It affects every man or woman who occupies that high office. So as we said with the first article of impeachment, we believe the second article of impeachment is invalid and should also be rejected. In passing the first article of impeachment, the House attempted to usurp the president's constitutional power to determine policy, especially foreign policy. In passing the second article of impeachment, the House attempted to control the constitutional privileges and immunities of the executive branch. All of this while simultaneously disrespecting the framer's system of checks and balances, which designates the judicial branch as the arbiter of interbranch disputes. By approving both articles, the House of Representatives violated our constitutional order, illegally abused their power of impeachment in order to obstruct the president's ability to faithfully execute the duties of his office. These articles fail on their face as they do not meet the constitutional standard for impeachable offenses. No amount of testimony could change that fact. We've already discussed some of the specifics. I think Alexander Hamilton's been quoted a lot, and there's a reason. What has occurred over the past 2 weeks, really the past 3 months, is exactly what Alexander Hamilton and other founders of our great country feared. I believe that Hamilton was prophetic in Federalist 65 when he warned how impeachment had the ability to agitate, his words, the passions of the whole community and divide it into parties more or less friendly or inimical to the accused. He warned that impeachment would, and I quote, connect itself with pre-existing fractions and will enlist all their animosities, partialities, influence, and interest on one side or on the other. He continued, the convention, it appears, thought the Senate, this body, most fit as the depository of this important trust. Those who best can discern the intrinsic difficulty of the thing will be the least hasty in condemning that opinion and will be most inclined to allow due weight to the arguments which may be supposed to have produced it. In the same Federalist 65, Hamilton regarded the members of this Senate not only as the inquisitors for the nation, but as the representatives of the nation as a whole. He said these words, quote, where else than in the Senate could have been found a tribunal sufficiently dignified or significantly independent? What other body would be likely to feel confident enough in its own situation to preserve unawed and uninfluenced the necessary impartiality between an individual accused and the representatives of the people, his accusers? You took an oath. They questioned the oath. You are sitting here as a trier of fact. They said the Senate's on trial. Based on all of the presentations that we've made in our trial brief and the arguments that we've put forward today, again, we believe both articles should be immediately rejected. Now, our nation's representatives holding office in this great body must unite today to protect our Constitution and separation of powers. And you know, there was a time not that long ago, even within this administration, where bipartisan agreements could be reached to serve the interests of the American people. Take a listen to this. Take a look.
And today we had a beautiful bipartisan moment where Democrats and Republicans are working together to keep that fentanyl out of our country, to use these devices to accomplish that goal. It's not perfect. We need to do a lot more. But today was a very good step, and I want to praise all of the people, Democrats and Republicans and the president, for working together on this bill.
As has been said, and we can see by the people assembled here, if we work together in a bipartisan way, we can get things done. And this is a place where we can all agree that we've got to do more and where we can work together. So I applaud everyone's efforts.
We are proudly joined today by so many members of Congress, Republicans, Democrats, who worked very, very hard on this bill. This was really an effort of everybody. It was a bipartisan success, something you don't hear too much about, but I think you will be. I actually believe we maybe will be over the coming period of time. I hope so. I think so. It's so good for the country. Thank everybody. This was incredible bipartisan support. We passed this in the Senate 87 to 12. That's unheard of. And then in the House, we passed it 358 to 36.
Be here to help celebrate your signing this next step in this critical Women's Growth and Prosperity and Development Initiative. It dovetails nicely with the BUILD Act, bipartisan bill you signed into law, with the WE Act, which recognizes this as a critical strategy. So I think this is a tremendous initiative. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
This is what the American people expect. I simply ask this body to stand firm today. Protect the integrity of the United States Senate. Stand firm today and protect the office of the President. Stand firm today and protect the Constitution. Stand firm today and protect the will of the American people and their vote. Stand firm today and protect our nation. And I ask that this partisan impeachment come to an end, to restore our constitutional balance. For that is, in my view and in our view, what justice demands and the Constitution requires.